Hi, and welcome to the second hour of Focal Point on AFR Talk. This Tuesday edition of Focal Point on the American Family Radio Talk Network, the most feared and dangerous radio network in America. Want to get right to our special guest here at the top of the hour. Andy McCarthy is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, contributing editor at National Review. And you might remember that there was a World Trade Center bombing prior to 2001, prior to 9/11, 1993, the World Trade Center was bombed, number of victims, and Andy McCarthy was the prosecutor that put the blind sheikh, the mastermind of that first World Trade Center bombing, behind bars. Andy, welcome back to Focal Point with Brian Fisher.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, Andy, I wanted to talk to you specifically. I got a couple of things I hope we'll have time to get to, but specifically, I wanted to talk to you. You got a great column today at PJ Media on what's happened with the victims at Fort Hood. Now, I think most of our listeners are probably aware of the fact that Major Nadal Malik Hassan jumped up on a table, shouted Allahu Akbar, started shooting his fellow soldiers, killed 13 of them, 14 if you count the unborn child one of the victims was carrying, and wounded about 30 others. And so the military had to consider whether to give these victims of this shooting the Purple Heart. They've made their decision, and I'm as outraged, I think, as you are, Andy. Tell us what the government has decided and why that's such a travesty.
Well, the government has decided, Brian, not to give the Purple Heart to the wounded, the Purple Heart medal to the wounded people in this jihadist atrocity, which as you mentioned, the case I was involved in 1993, we had one victim who was 8 months pregnant at the time. So if you count that as 7 murders, the Fort Hood travesty actually involves almost twice the number of people killed in the 1993 terrorist bombing, which the government has never shied away from calling a terrorist attack. Yet at Fort Hood, they've called it workplace violence. And now, when it came time to recognize the sacrifice of the wounded who were undoubtedly attacked in a jihadist operation in wartime, as they were about actually to deploy to the war zones overseas, the military has nevertheless denied them the Purple Heart. The explanation they give is that they don't want to prejudice the trial of Major Hassan, and as I argue in the column that you were good enough to mention, that has to be a pretext because it's a preposterous explanation.
Well, and tell us, Andy, tell us why that's a preposterous explanation, that giving these victims of this jihadist terror attack, giving them a Purple Heart, why it's preposterous to think that that would jeopardize his right to a fair trial.
Well, in a trial, whether it's in the military justice system or the civilian justice system, the finding of guilt or innocence is for the jury and the jury alone, and they are kept away from and told to disregard any outside fact finders' conclusions about the case. So it's no more relevant to the guilt or innocence of Hassan at trial that the military decided to give, or that the military could decide to give Purple Heart medals, than that it decided not to give them. It's simply not relevant to the jury's conclusion. And frankly, as I explain in the article, there has been almost no coverage about the Purple Heart controversy. Yet everybody knows, who knows anything about the case, that Hassan has been in jail for upwards of 4 years now in connection with this atrocity, and that's because a judge determined that he was a danger to the community. So that's a finding of the outside of an outside fact finder that the military doesn't seem to be too concerned is going to prejudice the trial.
You'd think if anything was going to prejudice, it was going to be a judge saying, look, this is a guy who's a danger to society. We've got to keep him locked up. And plus, Andy, you point out that he was prepared to enter a plea.
Yes, something that we know through his lawyers. So I actually, as I said at the bottom there, of the column, There were many days as a federal prosecutor when I had very stressful arguments before the court, but this would be one that would be fun to go in and argue. If you thought about, a claim of prejudice by defense lawyers that the Purple Heart was going to prejudice the trial when the defense lawyers themselves had publicly announced that the guy wanted to plead guilty.
Huh. And it strikes me, we talk about sort of kind of creeping Sharia, sort of de facto Sharia, and I mean, this is probably a bridge too far, but it seems to me almost we're at a place now where the military doesn't want to give our own servicemen and women a Purple Heart because we don't want to offend a Muslim. That just sounds like de facto Sharia.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on here. One of them is the one that you've just outlined, and I think that's a powerful impulse on their part. The military has become maybe the most politically correct of the many bureaucracies in government that are seized by political correctness. If you recall, their own report about the Fort Hood atrocity, which they also don't seem to be too concerned will prejudice the jury, goes on for about 75 pages and never mentions the word Islam or jihad or anything along those lines, even though we know that is what the ideology of that inspired Hassan to commit this atrocity. So, odd that you would examine what happened here and not go anywhere near what impelled it to happen. So I think that's one big part of it. The other big part of it is something I saw. It's kind of a replication of something I saw back in the investigation of the Blind Sheikh's terror cell back in the early 1990s. And that is that if you were going to have a trial that got into the jihadist motivations of Hassan, you would have to get into the fact that the government thoroughly, well, I shouldn't say thoroughly, but the government was intimately familiar with the fact that Hassan was actually having communications with this character, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the al-Qaeda recruiter and operative who was ultimately killed at the direction of President Obama in a drone strike in Yemen. So they knew that Hassan was having these communications with a dangerous jihadist, and they decided not only to not take any action on that, but actually promoted him. So, a competent investigation wouldn't have allowed Hassan to be anywhere near being able to commit the atrocity that he committed at Fort Hood. So I think they don't want to get into that for that embarrassing reason as well.
Our guest has been Andy McCarthy. He is a senior fellow at National Review Institute, contributing editor at National Review. He was the prosecutor that put the Blind Sheikh, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, behind bars. You can read his column, the full title of his column, "The Claim That Awarding Purple Hearts to Hassan's Victims Would Prejudice His Murder Trial Is Ridiculous." And Andy, just 15 seconds, military tribunals actually have a reputation for being better dispensers of justice than civilian courts.
Yeah, they do, because their juries are commissioned officers who follow their orders, including orders not to pay attention to outside fact finders.
Our guest has been Andy McCarthy, senior fellow at National Review Institute. Andy, as always, thank you very much. Very informative.
Thanks, Brian.
Back in 2, stay with us. Focal Point AFR Talk.